Some promises are so simple that only a dog believes them completely. On a quiet stretch of rural Montana, where a narrow two-lane road bends past cottonwood trees and an old wooden porch faces the distant mountains, a German shepherd sat watching the horizon as if time itself had forgotten to move. His name was Rex, though most people in the small town of Alder Creek no longer remembered that. To them, he was simply the dog that waited. Every morning the sun climbed slowly above the pale blue ridges to the east, spilling soft light across the gravel driveway and the empty yard, and Rex would already be there, sitting squarely on the weathered boards of the porch with his ears raised and his amber eyes fixed on the road that stretched nearly half a mile toward the highway. Cars passed sometimes, a pickup headed to the feed store, a school bus rumbling by in the distance, the occasional traveler cutting through the valley on the long route between towns. Each time an engine echoed across the fields, Rex stood up with quiet urgency, tail lifting, body alert, hope flickering alive in the steady rhythm of his breathing. Then the sound would fade, the dust would settle, and he would sit again. People began noticing sometime during the second winter. Alder Creek wasn't a place where much changed. Everyone knew the rhythm of the seasons by heart. The first frost in October, the heavy snowfalls after Christmas, the long thaw that turned the dirt roads soft in March. Yet through all of it, Rex remained. Snow gathered along the porch railings and sometimes dusted his dark sable coat until he looked like part of the landscape itself, but he never left for long. When the wind pushed cold air down from the mountains, he curled briefly against the door, then returned to his watch. Neighbors tried leaving food now and then. A bowl of water in summer. A blanket once when the temperature dipped below 20 degrees. Rex accepted these things politely, the way a disciplined dog might, but his attention always drifted back to the road. Because 3 years earlier a man had walked down those same porch steps, knelt beside him, and placed both hands gently around his neck. The man's name was Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter, a white American soldier who had grown up in that very house, and who had once found Rex as a small injured puppy along the shoulder of that same country road. From that moment forward, they had rarely been apart. Morning runs across the open fields. Fishing trips beside the cold river 5 miles north of town. Quiet evenings where Rex rested his head on Daniel's boot while the sun sank behind the hills. Then one autumn morning, a military truck arrived in the driveway. Daniel's duffel bag waited beside the door, and Rex watched with puzzled eyes as his friend prepared to leave. Daniel had knelt down, scratched behind Rex's ears the way he always did, and spoken softly in the calm voice Rex trusted more than anything in the world. "Guard the house, buddy. I'll be back before you know it." The truck had rolled away down the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and Rex had chased it to the edge of the property before stopping exactly where the porch view began. That was the place he chose to wait. And 3 years later, he was still there. Before the porch grew silent, and the seasons began turning without him. There had been mornings when the house was full of small, ordinary sounds that meant everything to a dog. The screen door creaking open just after sunrise. Boots stepping onto the wooden boards. The faint smell of coffee drifting out from the kitchen window. Rex remembered those mornings the way dogs remember best. Not through words, but through scent and rhythm and the quiet language of routine. 3 years earlier the yard had been alive with movement. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter would step outside wearing a gray sweatshirt and worn running shoes, stretching his arms toward the pale Montana sky, while Rex circled impatiently at his side, tail sweeping across the porch like a metronome, keeping time. The fields beyond the house stretched wide and open for nearly 200 yards before meeting a thin line of trees that followed the bend of a narrow creek. That land had become their training ground, their playground, and their refuge all at once. Daniel would clap his hands once and Rex would spring forward, paws pounding across the grass with the effortless strength of a young German shepherd, muscles moving like quiet machinery beneath his thick sable coat. Sometimes they ran together for nearly a mile down the dirt path that wound along the property line. Other mornings Daniel practiced commands the way he had learned during years in the army. Sit, stay, guard. Rex learned quickly, not because of discipline, but because of the bond forming between them day by day. Daniel had found him when he was only a few months old, thin and trembling beside a roadside ditch just outside town after a summer thunderstorm had passed through the valley. The small puppy had lifted his head when Daniel knelt beside him, amber eyes bright despite the mud clinging to his fur, and something in that moment had settled quietly between them, like an agreement neither needed to speak aloud. From that day forward, Rex followed Daniel everywhere. When Daniel repaired the old fence near the barn, Rex lay in the grass watching every movement as though supervising the work. When Daniel drove his dusty pickup truck into town for supplies, Rex sat proudly in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears fluttering in the Montana wind as the road rolled past beneath them. In the evenings, they often walked to the edge of the property where the creek curved gently through tall reeds. Daniel would sit on a smooth flat rock with a fishing pole resting loosely in his hands while Rex stood nearby listening to the soft current moving through the stones. Those were the quiet hours when the world seemed simple and steady. But life has a way of changing its direction without warning. One afternoon near the end of October, a white envelope arrived in the mailbox at the edge of the driveway. Daniel stood there reading it while Rex waited beside him, head tilted slightly, as if sensing the shift in the air. The letter carried official orders, the kind that sent soldiers far from home for longer than anyone could easily explain to a dog. Daniel folded the paper slowly, looking out across the open field where the sun was beginning to settle behind the mountains. Rex stepped closer and pressed his nose gently against Daniel's hand, not understanding the words written on that page, but feeling the weight of them all the same. The following morning the valley felt quieter than usual, as though the land itself understood that something was about to change. Frost covered the grass in a thin silver layer, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine drifting down from the mountains. Rex stepped onto the porch beside Daniel Carter and watched the pale sky slowly brighten above the distant hills. Inside the house, a duffel bag rested near the door, packed the night before with careful precision, the way soldiers prepare for long journeys. Daniel moved through the kitchen calmly, pouring the last cup of coffee he would drink in that house for a long time. Rex followed every step, his paws tapping softly against the wooden floor as if trying to memorize the rhythm of the morning. Dogs notice things humans often overlook: the weight in a voice, the slower movement of hands, the silence that settles between ordinary words. Rex felt all of it, even though he could not understand the reason behind it. When the low rumble of an approaching engine finally echoed up the gravel driveway, Rex lifted his head instantly. The sound was unfamiliar but purposeful, a government-issued truck rolling to a stop near the front gate. Daniel set his cup down slowly and stepped outside. The morning sun had just cleared the ridge line, casting long golden beams across the open field. Rex stood beside him with alert ears and steady eyes, his body leaning slightly against Daniel's leg the way he often did when something uncertain approached. Two uniformed soldiers waited beside the vehicle, their expressions calm and respectful, giving Daniel a moment before the long road ahead. Daniel knelt down on the porch steps and placed both hands on Rex's shoulders, looking directly into the dog's amber eyes. For a few seconds neither moved. The breeze rustled the dry autumn grass across the yard, and a crow called from the cottonwood tree near the fence line. Daniel smiled softly, the kind of quiet smile a man gives when he wants to make something difficult seem simple. He scratched gently behind Rex's ears the way he had done 1,000 times before, and spoke in the steady voice Rex trusted more than anything in the world. "Guard the house, buddy. I will be back before you know it." Rex tilted his head slightly, absorbing the tone, if not the meaning. To him the words sounded like any other command, another promise wrapped in the familiar cadence of Daniel's voice. When Daniel stood and lifted the duffel bag, Rex followed him down the porch steps and across the gravel driveway. The truck engine idled patiently as Daniel climbed into the passenger seat. The door closed with a firm metallic click. For a moment the world held its breath. Then the vehicle began moving slowly toward the road. Rex trotted alongside it at first, tail raised, expecting Daniel to step back out at any second the way he sometimes did during short errands in town. But the truck continued forward past the mailbox and down the long dirt stretch that connected the property to the highway nearly half a mile away. Rex kept running, paws kicking up small clouds of dust, until the vehicle became smaller against the distant horizon. Finally, he stopped near the exact point where the driveway met the road. The engine noise faded into silence, and the empty Montana landscape stretched quietly in every direction. Rex stood there for a long moment watching the place where the truck had disappeared. Then he turned slowly and walked back toward the porch. From that day forward, the porch became his post, and the road became the only place that mattered. The first evening after the truck disappeared down the long dirt road, Rex remained standing near the porch steps long after the sun dipped behind the mountains. The golden light slowly faded across the fields until the open valley turned a deep shade of blue, and the air cooled with the familiar chill that arrived every autumn night in Montana. Rex listened carefully to every distant sound. A pickup passing somewhere far down the highway. The faint rustle of dry grass bending in the wind. The soft creak of the porch boards beneath his paws as he shifted his weight and watched the road that led away from the house. To Rex, the world still felt normal. Daniel Carter had left before and returned later in the day. Sometimes the truck from town would carry him away for hours at a time, while Rex waited patiently beside the front gate. Waiting was something Rex understood well. So that first night, he simply stayed where he believed he was supposed to be. When darkness settled over the valley and the stars began filling the wide Montana sky, Rex curled near the front door for a short while, resting but not sleeping deeply. Every few minutes his ears lifted toward the road, alert for the familiar sound of tires crunching across gravel. Morning arrived quietly, the same way it always had. Pale sunlight crept over the ridge, and the long shadows of the cottonwood trees stretched across the yard. Rex stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, scanning the road with calm expectation. A dog does not measure time the way humans do. Minutes and hours mean little compared to patterns and presence. Daniel had said he would return, and Rex believed that completely. Days began to pass with a steady rhythm. Each morning Rex positioned himself at the same spot on the porch facing the driveway. From there he could see nearly half a mile of road stretching across the open land before it disappeared behind a gentle bend near the highway. Whenever a distant engine echoed through the valley, Rex stood instantly, tail lifting with cautious excitement. Sometimes it was a farmer driving a dusty pickup toward town. Sometimes it was the county mail truck delivering letters to the metal box beside the gate. Each time Rex watched carefully until the vehicle passed, and the sound faded again into silence. After a few weeks, the neighbors began to notice the routine. Mrs. Harper from the nearby ranch often drove past the Carter property on her way to the feed store in Alder Creek. She would slow her truck slightly when she saw the German Shepherd sitting squarely on the porch, ears forward and eyes locked on the road, as though guarding something invisible. One afternoon she stopped and stepped out of her vehicle, carrying a small metal bowl filled with fresh water. Rex approached politely, sniffing her hand with quiet curiosity before returning to his place near the porch rail. He was not interested in wandering far. His post was here. As autumn slowly turned toward winter, the winds grew colder, and the grass across the valley turned pale and brittle. Frost coated the porch boards each morning, and sometimes snow drifted lightly across the yard during the night. Yet Rex remained steady in his quiet duty. He watched the road when the sun rose. He watched it again when the long Montana sunset painted the mountains orange and purple. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a lonely habit. But to Rex it was something simpler than that. It was the promise he had heard in Daniel Carter's voice on that final morning. And to a dog, a promise does not fade with time. Winter arrived slowly across the Alder Creek Valley, the kind of Montana winter that did not rush, but settled in quietly, like a long breath of cold air drifting down from the mountains. By late November, the grass across Daniel Carter's property had turned pale and stiff, and thin sheets of ice formed along the edges of the narrow creek that ran behind the house. Rex noticed every change the way animals do, through the feel of the ground beneath his paws and the scent of the wind moving across the open land. Each morning, he stepped onto the porch and watched the same stretch of road that had carried Daniel away weeks earlier. Snow began falling in soft layers that coated the wooden boards and gathered along the porch railing. But Rex remained in his usual place, his thick German Shepherd coat collecting small white flakes as he scanned the empty driveway. At first, the waiting still felt temporary. Cars continued to pass the property every few days, and Rex reacted to each distant engine with hopeful attention. He would rise quickly, ears forward, watching the vehicle approach across the half-mile stretch of dirt road. Sometimes he even trotted halfway down the driveway before realizing the truck belonged to someone else. When the sound faded again, he would return to the porch and sit facing the road as if resetting his watch. The people of Alder Creek gradually became familiar with the quiet sentinel on the Carter porch. Farmers passing with feed trailers often slowed their trucks slightly when they saw the dog sitting there in the cold morning light. A few neighbors occasionally left small bags of dog food near the steps or filled a metal bowl with water before driving away again. Rex accepted these offerings with calm gratitude, but never followed anyone far beyond the gate. The property still smelled like Daniel Carter. His boots had walked across this porch. His hands had opened that front door. The wind carried faint traces of his scent from the wooden fence posts and the tools hanging in the small barn behind the house. To Rex, those scents were not memories. They were signs that Daniel still belonged here and would return along the same road he had taken that autumn morning. Weeks slowly turned into months. By January, the valley lay under several inches of packed snow that reflected the pale winter sunlight like a wide white mirror. Rex's routine never changed. At sunrise, he stood at the porch railing scanning the horizon. At midday, he circled the yard once before returning to the exact place where he could see the road bend near the highway. At sunset, he remained there again as the sky turned orange behind the mountains and the temperature dropped sharply with the coming night. The house behind him grew quieter as time passed. The mailbox filled with unopened letters. The wooden fence near the barn sagged slightly beneath the weight of the snow. Yet Rex stayed steady, his loyalty measured not in days, but in the simple rhythm of watching and waiting. Because somewhere deep in the instincts that guided him, Rex still believed the same thing he had believed the moment Daniel Carter spoke those final words on the porch steps. A promise had been made. And to a dog who trusts his human completely, a promise is something worth waiting for. By the time the first winter ended, the routine had become part of the landscape of Alder Creek. Snow eventually melted beneath the warm breath of early spring winds, revealing the brown grass beneath and the long dirt driveway that stretched from the Carter house to the quiet county road. Rex noticed the change in the air immediately. The ground softened beneath his paws, and the scent of thawing earth drifted through the valley. Birds returned to the cottonwood trees near the fence line, filling the mornings with soft calls that echoed across the fields. Yet the porch remained Rex's post, just as it had been since the morning Daniel Carter left. Every day followed the same quiet pattern. At sunrise, Rex stepped to the edge of the porch and scanned the road with calm focus. At midday, he circled the property slowly, checking the fence line, the small barn, and the creek behind the house before returning to his place. When evening arrived and the mountains glowed under the fading sunlight, he watched the road again, ears lifting at every distant sound. People in the town of Alder Creek began speaking about the dog more often as the months passed. At the small diner near Main Street, where farmers gathered for coffee each morning, someone would eventually glance toward the highway and mention the German shepherd who still guarded the Carter place. Some believed the soldier might return any day. Others quietly wondered how long the dog would continue waiting. Mrs. Harper drove by the property almost every afternoon while returning from the feed store, and she made a habit of stopping near the gate once or twice each week. She brought fresh water and sometimes a small portion of cooked chicken wrapped in paper. Rex greeted her politely with a calm wag of his tail, but never followed her when she returned to her truck. His attention always drifted back toward the empty road stretching across the valley. Spring slowly turned into summer. The grass across the fields grew tall and green under the warm Montana sun, and the creek behind the house ran clear and lively again. Dust sometimes rose from the driveway when passing vehicles stirred the dry earth, and Rex would stand quickly each time he heard the rumble of an approaching engine. Hope still lived in those small moments. Every truck that appeared on the distant horizon carried the possibility that Daniel Carter had finally returned. Each time the vehicle passed without stopping, Rex settled calmly back onto the porch, as patient as the mountains surrounding the valley. Months continued slipping by in this quiet rhythm. The house itself grew more silent with time. The mailbox filled with envelopes that remained unopened. The barn door creaked softly when the wind pushed through the valley in the late afternoon. But Rex remained exactly where he believed he was meant to be. Through warm afternoons and cool summer nights, he kept his steady watch over the road that led away from the Carter home. Because somewhere deep within his loyal instincts, Rex still believed the same simple truth that had guided him from the beginning. The man he trusted had promised to come back. And until that moment arrived, the porch would remain his post, and the road would remain his answer. By the time the second winter arrived in Alder Creek, the story of the waiting dog had quietly become part of the town itself. Snow returned once again to the valley, settling across the open fields in soft white blankets that stretched all the way to the distant mountains. The Carter house stood quietly beneath the pale winter sky, its porch weathered by time and wind, and Rex still sat in the same familiar place facing the road. His coat had grown thicker during the cold months, the dark sable fur around his neck forming a natural collar that helped shield him from the sharp Montana air. Yet even as the seasons continued to pass, something subtle had begun to change. The hopeful bursts of energy Rex once showed whenever a vehicle appeared had become slower now, calmer, almost thoughtful. When the distant rumble of an engine drifted across the valley, Rex still stood and watched carefully, but he no longer ran down the driveway the way he had during those first months. Instead, he remained near the porch steps, observing patiently as trucks passed by on the road without stopping. The people of Alder Creek had grown used to seeing him there through every kind of weather. Children riding the yellow school bus sometimes pressed their faces against the windows as the driver slowed near the Carter property. The driver, a middle-aged man named Carl Benton, often glanced toward the porch and shook his head gently. 3 years earlier, he had seen the same dog sprinting beside the departing military truck with bright energy in his stride. Now Rex looked older, steadier, like a quiet guardian carved into the landscape itself. Occasionally Carl would leave a bag of dry dog food near the gate when his route finished for the day. Rex accepted these gestures with quiet appreciation, though he rarely wandered far from the house. The property still carried the scent of Daniel Carter in small, lingering traces. The porch boards, the fence posts, the worn leather strap hanging near the barn door. To Rex, those scents meant something important. They meant the story was not finished yet. Late one afternoon near the end of February, the sky above Alder Creek turned a deep shade of gray as clouds gathered along the mountain ridge. A light snow began drifting down across the valley, coating the dirt road in a thin layer of white. Rex watched the road as he always did, ears lifting when a distant engine echoed faintly through the cold air. A vehicle approached slowly from the direction of the highway, its headlights glowing softly through the falling snow. For a moment Rex stood very still, his posture alert but calm. The vehicle passed the Carter property without stopping and continued down the road toward town. Rex lowered himself back onto the porch boards, his gaze still fixed on the empty stretch of road disappearing into the winter landscape. The wind carried the scent of snow and pine through the valley as evening settled quietly over the mountains. Inside the house the rooms remained dark and silent, untouched by human footsteps for a long time. Yet outside, on the porch facing the road, Rex continued his patient watch. Because somewhere deep within his loyal heart, the promise spoken years ago still lived with the same quiet strength. And until the day that promise returned along that road, the German Shepherd would remain exactly where he believed he was meant to be. Spring returned once again to the valley surrounding Alder Creek, carrying with it the soft warmth that slowly pushed winter back toward the distant mountains. Snow melted from the fields and the dirt road stretching past the Carter property began to show through again, dark and familiar beneath the pale Montana sky. Rex noticed the change in the air the way he always did. The wind carried the scent of wet soil and fresh grass, and the creek behind the house ran louder now as the melting snow from higher elevations fed the clear water moving through the valley. Another year had passed quietly around him, though Rex did not measure time in that way. For him, there was only the rhythm of watching and waiting. Each morning he stepped onto the porch and faced the road just as he had done since the day Daniel Carter left. His movements had grown slower over time, but his attention had not faded. His amber eyes still scanned the half-mile stretch of road leading toward the highway, and his ears lifted whenever a distant engine echoed across the open fields. The town of Alder Creek had changed slightly during those years. A new sign had been placed outside the small grocery store on Main Street. The diner had repainted its windows. Children who once rode the school bus past the Carter property were now taller and quieter as they watched the dog who remained at his post through every season. Many people had begun to believe that Rex had become part of the town itself, like the mountains or the winding creek that ran behind the old house. But not everyone had forgotten the man who once lived there. One warm afternoon near the beginning of April, a dusty pickup truck rolled slowly into the small gas station near the edge of town. The driver stepped out carefully, stretching his legs after a long journey. His name was Daniel Carter. The years had changed him in ways that were not immediately visible to strangers. His posture was steady but thoughtful, and his eyes carried the quiet weight of time spent far from home. He walked inside the small station to buy a cup of coffee, the bell above the door chiming softly as he entered. Behind the counter stood an older woman named Margaret Lewis who had lived in Alder Creek for nearly 30 years. She glanced up casually at first, then paused as recognition slowly crossed her face. Daniel Carter had been gone a long time, but small towns remember their people. Margaret studied him for a moment before speaking gently. "You finally made it back." Daniel offered a small smile, the kind a man gives when he is still adjusting to the idea of home. "It took a while," he replied quietly. As Margaret handed him the coffee, she hesitated for a second as though deciding whether to say something important. Then she nodded toward the road outside the window that led toward the Carter property. "Your dog never stopped waiting for you," she said. Daniel froze for a brief moment, the words settling slowly into his mind. 3 years had passed since the morning he left that porch. 3 years of distance, time, and uncertainty. Yet somewhere out there beyond the town, a German shepherd was still watching the road. Daniel Carter stood motionless beside the counter inside the small gas station, the warm paper cup of coffee forgotten in his hand as Margaret Lewis's words settled heavily in the quiet space between them. Outside the window, the road stretched toward the valley exactly the way he remembered it, winding past open fields before disappearing toward the Carter property nearly 3 miles away. "Your dog never stopped waiting for you." The sentence echoed in Daniel's mind with a strange mixture of disbelief and quiet hope. 3 years was a long time in a place like Alder Creek. Long enough for seasons to come and go, for fences to weather, and paint to fade on old barns. Yet the idea that Rex might still be there felt almost impossible to understand. Daniel stepped outside into the mild spring air and stood beside his dusty pickup truck for a moment, looking toward the direction of home. The mountains in the distance were the same pale blue he remembered, and the wind carried the familiar scent of grass warming under the afternoon sun. Slowly he climbed into the truck and turned the key. The engine started with a low, steady rumble that felt strangely comforting after so much time away. The road leading out of town was quiet, bordered by wide pastures and scattered cottonwood trees whose branches were beginning to fill with new leaves. As Daniel drove, every mile seemed to pull another memory from the past. The bend where he used to slow down because Rex loved to stick his head out the passenger window and feel the wind rush through his fur. The old wooden fence near the creek where they once stopped during morning runs. The mailbox that marked the entrance to the Carter property finally came into view after several minutes of driving. Daniel slowed the truck instinctively, his eyes searching the familiar yard beyond the gate. The house stood exactly where it always had, weathered but steady beneath the wide Montana sky. The barn door leaned slightly to one side now, and the grass had grown uneven across the yard. But the porch remained unchanged, facing the road with quiet patience. Daniel parked the truck near the edge of the driveway and stepped out slowly. The sound of the door closing seemed louder than it should have been in the still afternoon air. For a moment he simply stood there, unsure whether he should move forward or call out. Then he saw a shape resting near the porch steps. Rex was lying there with his head lowered against his front paws, his sable coat touched with a few faint strands of gray that had not been there years earlier. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly when the truck engine stopped, ears turning toward the unfamiliar sound. Daniel took one careful step across the gravel driveway, his heart beating faster than he expected. He had imagined this moment many times during the long months away, yet standing here now felt strangely uncertain. Rex watched, quietly from the porch, studying the man walking toward the house as though trying to understand something that did not yet feel real. Daniel Carter stopped several yards from the porch, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots as the quiet Montana afternoon wrapped around the moment. For 3 years he had imagined this place exactly as it once was, yet standing here now felt strangely unfamiliar. The house seemed smaller somehow, the paint more faded, the wooden boards worn by time and weather. But the porch was still there, and on that porch lay the one thing he had hoped might still remain. Rex lifted his head slowly, his ears turning toward the sound of the approaching footsteps. The German shepherd rose to his feet with the calm caution of an older dog, his amber eyes studying the man walking toward him. For a long second the two simply watched one another across the small yard. Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly as he took another step forward. Rex did not bark. He did not run forward the way he once would have years ago. Instead, he stood quietly on the porch, his posture steady but uncertain, as if trying to understand what his senses were telling him. Daniel could see the changes in him now. The once young dog with endless energy had matured into something quieter and stronger. His thick coat carried faint strands of gray along the edges of his muzzle, and his movements held the calm patience of time spent waiting through many seasons. Daniel stopped near the bottom step of the porch and slowly crouched down, lowering himself so that his eyes were level with the dog's. He did not rush forward. Something about the moment demanded stillness. The wind moved gently through the tall grass around the yard, carrying familiar scents from the barn and the nearby creek. Rex stepped forward once, carefully placing his paw on the edge of the porch as he leaned slightly closer to the man below. His nose lifted toward the air, catching traces of a scent that stirred something deep in his memory. Daniel remained still, his hands resting loosely against his knees. He spoke softly, his voice quiet but steady in the warm afternoon air. "Rex." The single word seemed to float across the small space between them. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, studying the man more closely now. The voice was familiar in a way that felt distant yet powerful, like a memory buried beneath layers of time. Rex stepped down from the porch and approached slowly, his paws moving carefully across the gravel. He circled once near Daniel, his nose working gently as he breathed in the scent carried on the man's jacket and hands. Daniel felt his heart beating harder now, each second stretching longer than the last. Then Rex paused beside him. The dog's ears lifted sharply as something finally clicked into place. The scent was not new. It was not unfamiliar. It was the same scent that had lived in this yard, on these porch boards, in every memory Rex had carried during the long seasons of waiting. For a brief moment Rex simply stood there, completely still, as recognition slowly awakened inside him. Rex's body remained perfectly still for one long second as the memory finished rising through his senses, and then everything changed at once. His ears lifted high, his tail gave a sudden powerful sweep through the air, and a low sound escaped from his chest that Daniel Carter had not heard in 3 long years. It was not a bark and it was not a growl. It was the sound of recognition breaking free after a lifetime of loyalty had been tested by time. Rex stepped forward quickly now, his movements no longer slow or cautious. Daniel barely had time to shift his weight before the German shepherd closed the small distance between them. The dog pressed forward with a burst of energy that seemed to carry the weight of every silent day spent on that porch. His front paws landed against Daniel's shoulders as his tail moved wildly behind him, and the quiet yard suddenly filled with the joyful sounds of a reunion that had waited far too long. Daniel laughed softly through the tightness in his chest as he wrapped his arms around the thick fur of the dog's neck. Rex leaned into him with complete trust, pressing his head beneath Daniel's chin the way he had done when he was younger. The years between them seemed to disappear in that single moment. Dust lifted gently from the gravel as Rex circled around Daniel and returned again, unable to contain the excitement rushing through him. His bright amber eyes followed every movement of the man he had waited for through countless sunrises and snowstorms. Daniel knelt fully now, resting one knee against the gravel while his hand moved slowly across Rex's back. The dog's coat felt familiar beneath his fingers, warm and steady despite the faint gray now touching the fur along his muzzle. Rex stood close beside him, leaning his weight lightly against Daniel's leg, as if confirming that this time the moment was real and not another passing truck or distant sound on the road. For several minutes neither of them moved far from that spot, near the porch steps. The wind moved quietly through the tall grass surrounding the yard, and the creek behind the house carried its steady song through the valley just as it had years earlier. Rex remained close, his tail wagging slowly now as his excitement settled into something calmer and deeper. Daniel reached up and scratched behind the dog's ears, the same familiar gesture that had always meant comfort and belonging. Rex closed his eyes briefly, leaning into the touch with quiet satisfaction. The porch, the road, and the empty seasons of waiting had finally led back to this moment. Daniel stood slowly and looked toward the old house, the same home he had left behind years before. Rex stayed beside him, alert and proud, his gaze occasionally returning to the road as though completing the final chapter of the duty he had carried for so long. The promise spoken on that autumn morning had finally come full circle, and the loyal German shepherd who had guarded that porch through every passing season now stood exactly where he belonged once again, beside the man he had never stopped believing would return. For a long time Daniel Carter remained standing beside the porch with Rex close at his side, both of them adjusting quietly to the strange feeling of the years finally closing behind them. The valley stretched wide and peaceful around the old house, the late afternoon sunlight washing across the fields the same way it had countless evenings before. Rex stayed pressed gently against Daniel's leg, occasionally glancing up at him, as if confirming again and again that the familiar presence beside him was real. Daniel rested one hand along the dog's back and slowly walked toward the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked softly beneath his boots as he climbed up and looked across the yard he had once known so well. The fence along the far edge of the field leaned slightly now, and the paint on the barn door had faded from years of wind and weather, but the place still carried the quiet strength of home. Rex followed closely behind him and settled onto the porch where he had spent so many mornings watching the road. This time, however, he did not face the horizon. Instead, he turned and lay beside Daniel, his head resting calmly near the soldier's boot. The change was small, but meaningful. For the first time in 3 years, Rex no longer needed to guard the road alone. Daniel sat down on the top step and looked out across the valley while the warm breeze moved gently through the tall grass surrounding the house. He reached down and rubbed Rex behind the ears again, the motion familiar and easy, like something that had never truly stopped. Rex closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly as though the long duty he had carried was finally finished. After a while Daniel stood and walked toward the front door, testing the old handle with a quiet push. The door opened with a soft creak, releasing the faint scent of wood and dust that had settled inside during the years away. Rex stepped inside carefully behind him, his nose moving gently through the air as he explored each room with calm curiosity. Every corner of the house still held traces of the life they once shared. The worn chair beside the window where Daniel had often rested after long days. The kitchen floor where Rex had waited patiently during countless mornings. The simple familiar details seemed to welcome them back without a word. As evening approached, the sky outside the windows slowly turned orange and purple over the distant mountains. Daniel stepped back onto the porch and looked toward the road once more. Rex joined him, but this time he did not sit facing the horizon. Instead, he stood beside Daniel with relaxed confidence, his tail moving slowly through the evening air. The long watch was over now. The promise that had carried him through years of quiet waiting had finally come true, and the porch that once held a lonely guard now held something far stronger. 2 companions standing side by side again, exactly where they belonged. The following morning arrived quietly over the Carter property, the first full sunrise Daniel had watched from that porch in 3 long years. The sky above the Montana Valley slowly shifted from deep blue to soft gold as the sun climbed above the distant mountains. Cool air drifted across the open fields, carrying the gentle scent of grass and the faint sound of the creek moving steadily behind the house. Daniel Carter stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand and paused for a moment, taking in the wide view that had once been part of his daily life. The valley looked almost exactly the same as it had the day he left. The cottonwood trees swayed lightly in the morning breeze, and the long dirt road stretched away from the house toward the highway like a quiet ribbon cutting through the fields. But this morning one thing was different. Rex was no longer sitting alone at the edge of the porch watching the road. Instead, the German shepherd lay calmly beside Daniel's boots, his head resting comfortably on his paws while his eyes followed the slow movement of the morning light across the yard. Every so often Rex lifted his head and glanced toward Daniel, as if simply appreciating the presence beside him. Daniel smiled quietly and reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, the familiar gesture returning as naturally as breathing. Rex leaned into the touch with relaxed confidence, his tail tapping gently against the wooden boards of the porch. The long watch that had defined his days for 3 years had finally ended, and the calm satisfaction of that truth seemed to settle deep into the rhythm of the morning. After a while, Daniel stepped down from the porch and walked toward the fence line that bordered the property. Rex followed immediately, his stride steady and strong as he moved across the grass beside the man he had waited for through countless seasons. They paused near the edge of the field where the land opened wide toward the mountains. Daniel looked out across the valley and breathed in slowly, feeling the quiet peace that only a place like this could offer. For a moment he thought about the years that had passed, the distance traveled, and the silent loyalty that had remained here waiting for him. Rex stood beside him with calm pride, his ears lifting slightly as the wind moved through the tall grass. The road behind them remained quiet, stretching back toward the town of Alder Creek, where people would soon begin their day. But Rex no longer needed to watch it the way he once had. His duty had been fulfilled with patience and faith that never faded. Daniel placed a hand gently along the dog's back and gave him a soft nod, as if acknowledging a partner who had completed a long and honorable mission. Together they turned back toward the house, walking side by side across the open yard. The porch that had once held a lonely sentinel now welcomed them both home, and the promise spoken years ago beneath that same Montana sky had finally become something simple and beautiful. Loyalty had waited, and at last it had been answered.